So let's start off. First off, I know some of you guys have anybody been to Mobile? Okay, we got a few people. Okay. Mobile's on the Gulf Coast. You can see it's located by Florida, Mississippi, just right there. That's Mobile Bay. Now, the grand strategy of the Union was the blockade. To get, to basically like a snake constrict the South. You guys know that. But along the Gulf Coast, the one defiant blockade running port that would go off to Cuba and elsewhere to bring in supplies, money and arms and everything else was Mobile, because New Orleans fell very early in the war, 1862. But Mobile remained an open blockade. They would run the blockade pretty regularly. Okay. All right. So some of you may have heard of the more well-known. Whenever I talk about, it was funny, a guy wrote a review and said, it didn't talk about the Battle of Mobile Bay. I also didn't talk about the Battle of Gettysburg either, because it's not what the book was about. This was the first. These were two separate deals. The Battle of Mobile Bay was primarily a Navy operation that was supported by the Army. The campaign for Mobile, what I'm going to talk about today, what my book's about, was the other way around. It was primarily an Army operation that was supposed to be supported by the Navy. The Battle of Mobile Bay, it was interesting because it pitted a Northerner, Buchanan, who fought for the South, against a Southerner from Tennessee who fought for the North. So you have Buchanan on the strongest ironclad ever was the Tennessee, and he took on the 18 gunboat fleet of Farragut. I'm not going to really go into a lot of details, but this was a significant battle. This was one of three events that occurred during the war that kind of guaranteed Lincoln got reelected. This was the first thing to kind of turn the tide. Come on in, Pete. We just started. I screwed up. I said we were doing the talk at Scotland Yard. So he went to Scotland Yard. He was hanging out. I'm with all the police here. Where are you? It's the street Scotland Yard. But Pete's in our Civil War roundtable in Mobile. And Pensacola. So this was a significant battle. What it did was it gave the Union, it sealed the port of Mobile. So no more blockade running. And it gave possession of the two forts, Fort Gaines and Fort Morgan, which are located, you can go still see there, they're very well preserved right there. But it sealed the port, gave possession of these two forts, which became staging camps for the subsequent invasion and siege of Mobile. It also gave the Navy freedom of movement through a good portion of Mobile Bay. So a significant battle, but it did not capture Mobile. And a lot of people erroneously say, well, Mobile wasn't really that important. It was just important to seal the port. But I'm going to tell you, there was a lot of reasons why it still was important, as important as in late March and April of 1865. The other thing that was significant about the Mobile Bay is where Admiral Farragut reportedly said, damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead. Have you heard this term?
Yeah.
You should. It influenced Tom Petty and the Heartbreaker. He actually had an album called Damn the Torpedoes. So, yeah, has some modern pop significance as well. Now, further up the bay was Mobile. And this is General Gordon Granger, who, by the way, we've got Juneteenth coming up, which is a big new holiday in the United States. And Gordon Granger, after he left Mobile, shortly thereafter, he issued that proclamation in Texas, which is now a big national holiday in the United States. But Granger was an aggressive guy, if you know anything about him, and he wanted to take Mobile as soon as possible. He only had about 1,500 troops, but it turns out he probably could have taken Mobile and saved a lot of bloodshed had they done it right then and there, because there was nobody in Mobile. There was hardly anybody there. I think they had like 800 troops. He had 1,500, but there was no one there because they were all fighting battles around Atlanta. So Mobile, most of his force was at the thing, but he didn't know that. General Canby didn't think it was a good idea. He declined, and Farragut also said it would be an elephant and would take a large army to hold. So he just didn't think it would. And again, this was a naval operation. He had fulfilled his naval obligations. He wanted to take Mobile, but it really wasn't in his interest. It was in the Army's interest, as we'll later see. And then here's Mobile. It's 30 miles This is where the Battle of Mobile Bay took place. The city of Mobile is kind of tucked up there. And what you'll find is Mobile's location was designed for defense because of the shoal waters and all the obstructions. And if you ever ride boats out in Mobile Bay, you've got to be careful because you could likely hit a sandbar. Okay. Now, this is why Mobile was still important as late as March of 1865. Mobile was the terminus of two major river systems, the Tom Bigby and the Alabama River that went up to Selma, up into and other places. It was a vast river system. Alabama has a vast river system. The river system was very important. So to end the war, to put that nail in the coffin of the Confederacy, you needed to capture Mobile. Grant had wanted to capture Mobile before at Vicksburg. He'd always wanted to do it. Farragut felt the same way. If you look at some of these early transmission, and a lot of people think that if they attacked Mobile earlier, it could have ended the war sooner. But they weren't in a position of power at that time, Grant, when he really wanted to do it. He kept getting overruled, and it just lingered on. But a lot of people think they should have taken Mobile before. And then there was two major rail lines that terminated in Mobile Bay. This is the Mobile and Ohio rail line that went all the way up, even though it had been cut. They just repaired it, and it went all the way up to Tupelo. In fact, after the Battle of Nashville, the Confederates regrouped at Tupelo, around Tupelo, in Verona, Mississippi, and then they came down to Mobile and Ohio to Mobile. And the rest of the Army of Tennessee also took this route, but went on to North Carolina. And then across the bay was the Mobile and Great Northern Rail Line that ran along the border of Florida. So you have two functioning rail lines. This rail line went up to Montgomery and into parts of Georgia. It's two functioning rail lines. Okay, so Mobile's value in 1865 was as a logistics center, a key logistics center to supply the Confederate forces that were still in the field. This gives you an idea how vast the river system is. That's where I live. I live right around here, right there. That's my neighborhood. Anyways, now don't take it from me that Mobile was important. It wasn't Canby or Farragut or anybody else who wanted to capture it in 1865. It was this guy. He still wanted it. As late as 1865, he was sending letter after letter to Canby to get the show on the road. He delayed too long. And there's Canby, who was in charge of the Department of West Mississippi, and basically take Mobile and hold it. Quit screwing around, get on the road. Grant was an aggressive guy. He didn't like a lot of wasted time. Now, the Confederate defenders were, the Army was under General Dabney Herndon Maury, and the Navy was under this guy, Ebenezer Farran. And they were all part of the Department of East Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama under Richard Taylor, who was the son of U.S. President Zachary Taylor, and also a former brother-in-law of Jefferson Davis, so a pretty important guy and highly regarded. Now, Arthur Fremantle, you guys know Arthur, who did his little tour of the Confederacy, and he visited Mobile before he went up to Gettysburg. And he got to meet Dabney Maury. Maury was a little guy, very gentlemanlike and intelligent, but diminutive Virginia. He was only about 5'3", short guy, right? I know you guys do the metric system, but he was short, okay? And Maury, one of his soldiers said he was every bit of a soldier. There just wasn't that many inches of him because he was a little guy. But he was a competent commander. Now, there was a huge disparity, as it was throughout the war, but especially at this time. The Union forces had over 45,400 troops, including an enormous naval presence it was actually 38 armed vessels, including 6 ironclads. So a tremendous force. The Confederates only had less than 10,000 troops anywhere in that region. So vastly outnumbered. However, what the Confederates had was 4 years to get ready for this. And they had, if you can see here, this is West Mobile, Phoebe, Caroline. This would be over by Murphy High School, kind of midtown Mobile. And they had 3 lines of enormous fortification, earthen fortification that they built over 4 years. And there was never any battles fought there, and so it did its job. It deterred battles in the first place. So they never tried to attack it from the west. And that gives you another idea of these vast fortifications that were surrounding the western approaches to Mobile. Best fortified place in the city, General Joseph Johnston said he came after Vicksburg fell. He came down and toured the defenses. And he said it's unbelievable. And time again, when they actually entered the city, the Union troops were just marveled at how strong the works were there on the western side. Okay. Now, at that time, there was a Prussian commander named Victor von Schilach. He was the chief engineer of the department, and he caught a lot of flack because his defenses failed during the Battle of Mobile Bay, and he was distraught. He didn't feel like he had the support he needed to carry out his defensive plan, so he was pretty pissed off at that time, and it was affecting his work. So they sent for this guy, Samuel Lockett, who designed Vicksburg's defenses. Okay, he was one of the chief engineer for the department under Richard Taylor. This guy had a young guy from Alabama, but before the war, he worked at what became Louisiana State University under General Sherman, who was the headmaster there at the time, or president of the school. And Sherman thought very highly of him. They actually named the engineering building after him at LSU, which I think they probably changed because he was a Confederate. And yeah, highly regarded guy. Now, this is a painting he did of Sherman before the war. And it was a life-size painting that hung in one of the buildings at LSU. But in the early 80s, some pranksters broke into this building and they stole the painting off the wall, rolled it up, took off that, another painting of historical significance, and never found it. So they stole that, but Lockett painted that one. And after the war, Sherman recommended Lockett because of what he did at Vicksburg with the vast defenses. You guys know about Vicksburg and his work there, his engineering prowess. He actually went to work for the Egyptians, a military engineer for Egypt after the war. Oh, and by the way, a lot of times the Southerners catch a bad rap, but you got to remember these guys who I'm mentioning, and I'll go over this a few times. These guys helped build the United States, literally. Lockett designed the base of the Statue of Liberty. So all this under here, that was Lockett's engineering work, Southerner. All right, so here's Canby. He was actually advised by General Sherman, who was stationed at Mobile before the war. Before he was president of LSU, he lived in Mobile, knew a lot about Mobile. And while he was besieging Atlanta, a major campaign, he was sending letters to both Henry Halleck and Canby, telling him what route he should take. And that's the advice that Canby followed. He basically went up the eastern shore of Baldwin County across the bay, and that was seen as the Achilles heel. And they hadn't put a lot of work there, but basically the U.S. forces' plan was to gain access to this river, the Blakely River. This is Fort Blakely. This is Spanish Fort. You gain access and then descend and basically flank the city of Mobile. That was their plan. But as you'll see, they had a rough go of it. Now, Richard Taylor, his only hope of reinforcement was that guy. You guys know who that is? Nathan Bedford Forrest, the guy that Northerners love to hate, right? Pretty confident. At this time, you have to understand, this guy was invincible up until this point. Until he never lost a battle that he was in command of. Now, he was involved in some others that didn't work out, that other people were in charge, but this guy was very feared. And rumors were constantly circulating that he's nearby. And actually, Maury had brought him down earlier for a party, just so that word would get out that he was in town to deter an attack. He was very infamous and a scary guy, and a very competent and very exceptional warrior. And basically, he said, if you can beat the forces in your front, we can relieve Mobile. So his plan was to send Forrest down. But little did Taylor realize the largest cavalry raid in the history of America was being launched from Tennessee. So Alabama was being attacked from both ends. Canby from the south, Wilson's raid from the north. But that was the plan. Okay, so on St. Patty's Day, March 17, 1865, the 13th Army Corps marches up from Fort Morgan along the peninsula, and they had a hell of a deal. It was raining. The roads were bad. He had over 13,000 troops that he had to march, heavy artillery, heavy wagons. They were getting stuck in the mud. They had to unload the wagons, pull their donkeys out of the mud, and they had to corduroy the roads where they would chop pine trees down and lay them perpendicular. So it was really a rough go of it, right? And a lot of times the horses or the donkeys would get their ankles stuck in between the logs and break the legs, and they'd have to shoot the horse. And so the road was littered with these dead horses leading up to it. But it took them a while. It was a really rough deal. They didn't meet a lot of resistance from the Confederates yet, but they had a lot of stuff they had to go through. Meanwhile, this is a little picture. You see the troops pushing the wagon. It was a contemporary drawing. Meanwhile, A.J. Smith, his corps was known as, the 16th Corps was known as the Guerrillas. It was a bunch of Midwestern farm guys, rough, infamous for foraging and scavenging and stealing and everything else. Lots of stories of that. But these guys are a rough bunch and a hard-nosed bunch. But they had a nice leisurely ride by boat into what's known as Bon Secours, Weeks Bay, and on up to a rendezvous point called Marlowe's Ferry. Today, it's the Marlowe community, still there, and there's still remnants of their encampment still there today, believe it or not. All right, so meanwhile, there was a feint. A brigade went up. This is the western shore of Mobile Bay. Excuse me. Slap me if I move around too much because I don't want to mess up the microphone. So as a feint movement, they had this brigade that went up of Mobile County side from Dolphin Island. And it's just a brigade, but they were instructed to make a lot of noise, the bands to play constantly. They only had one band. This band really sucked. It was a terrible band. They were poorly trained musicians, inexperienced, and they made a lot of musical errors on this march. But they were instructed to play over and over again, so it would give the impression that there was a large force heading for the Mobile, south of Mobile. So they sent down there, but basically they kept making the same musical errors over and over again, and the Union troops would laugh because it was so ridiculous how bad these guys were, and they think that that probably gave away the fact that it was just a feint. Okay, but what was interesting about this operation was this person, Albert Cashier, from the 95th Illinois, went along on the trek. And that's Albert. And Albert had fought in most of the important battles of the Western theater of the war. Only thing is, Albert was not actually a male. It was a female. Her name was, golly, I forget her name. Jenny Hodgers. That's correct. Yeah. And she fought the war, and they never found out that she was a female until the very end, like when she was on a rest home later in life, because she was hard for a single woman to find work at that time. And she just basically carried on as a man throughout her life. So they rendezvous here this is the eastern shore. Mobile's over here. They rendezvous here, and they went up in 3 columns through present day Fairhope, Daphne, Alabama, and then the 16th Corps was going to do a flanking movement. Right there on the I-10, where you probably went, Michael, when you guys visited, the highway right there, that's basically where the battle erupted. The Confederates thought that they could whip these guys soon, but they were ill-informed on the actual number of troops moving against them. So they had to fall back into the defenses of 2 forts, Spanish Fort and Fort Blakely, that were designed to keep the Union out of the river system. Okay, Spanish Fort is now a neighborhood. I live in Spanish Fort, by the way, and it was besieged starting on March 27th. The investment complete, and each day they would bring in more and more heavy artillery from Fort Morgan in Dolphin Island. They would ship it up there, and so it's like a big python just squeezing around the fort each day, getting closer and closer and getting more arms. But it was commanded by this guy, Randall Lee Gibson. Randall Lee Gibson was a 33-year-old commander, brigadier general, had fought in most of the major battles of the Western theater. And he was also, interesting about Gibson, he was highly educated, was the valedictorian at Yale. Very smart guy. And he led the defenses. And by all accounts, both Union and Confederates, he did a really good job at Spanish Fort with the little he had to work with. He also helped found Tulane University in New Orleans. And they have a building called Gibson Hall that's named after him. We have to be quiet about that because you know, a lot of guys will like to change it just because he was a Southerner. All right, this is what Spanish Fort looked like. The enemy line was here. Spanish Fort looked kind of, he described it as a fish hook that was bent open. But this is it. This is the river. And yeah, that's what it looked like. And Fort McDermott is still open to the public to this day. It's right there in the neighborhood. And a lot of the key positions are still visible if you know where to go and see it. So if any of you guys ever want to come to Mobile and tour the battlefield, I'll be glad to take you. Now, you got to remember at this point in the war, the Confederates in the Western Theater had suffered serious setbacks at Nashville, Franklin, Atlanta, one by one, really having a rough go of it, right? There were a lot of rumors that Mobile would be evacuated as soon as the Union troops entered the city or came anywhere near. And that was the rumor going on in the camps. So the Union guys said, you know, these Confederates, they couldn't possibly have any more fight left in them. There couldn't be any troops there. That was very far from the truth. In fact, the first week of the siege, I would argue that the Confederates actually had the upper hand, and they really took it to the Union forces. This is Lucius Hubbard, who went on to become governor of Minnesota. He was a young brigadier, actually a colonel at this point, but was breveted brigadier general after this campaign. He wrote a letter to his aunt. He wrote all these letters. I don't know why he wrote to his aunt so much, but basically they were astonished at the resistance that they met during this siege. It was unbelievable. And he kept writing. And this letter is just indicative of a lot of letters and diary accounts that I've read. They couldn't believe the resistance that they were meeting at Spanish Fort. Also, by the way, if you're going to go to Minnesota, they named a county after him, where Park Rapids is, right in the central part of the state. So anyways, but part of the reason why Mobile's defense was so good were these things. Both sides use them. Gum tree mortars. I had a cousin that worked for the Minnesota Historical Society, and he actually took me into the back room and showed me this gum tree mortar. And it's made from, a gum tree in Baldwin County. And they would do, these are very light, and they would bring them up into the advanced rifle pits, and they would lob shells into the Spanish fort. The Confederates also used these to lob shells back at them. So very effective. And I thought that was just so cool that they made these mortars out of this thing. And this particular one was made by a Minnesota soldier, and he brought it back with him home as a souvenir, and it was in the museum there now. They don't have it on display. But I thought it was so cool. And I was giving a talk to the Vicksburg Civil War Roundtable, and I was so excited about sharing this interesting weapon that was used, primitive weapon. And I went on and on just like I'm doing with you. And this little old lady who's also
I want to switch them. I want to switch.
Okay. It also serves as a docent at Vicksburg National Park. She kind of raised her hand. She goes, "We have those here." So I was making a big deal out of something that wasn't me. Anyways, I thought it was cool. Here's a drawing. This is a drawing that I'll have in my next book. And this is actually of a soldier drawn during the Battle of Spanish Fort, sitting. This is what the carriage looked like. So yeah. Now the other thing that's very unique about Mobile, nowhere else in the Civil War were more vessels sunk by torpedoes, and not torpedoes like we would know today. These were basically mines. And in Mobile, if you guys are familiar with Mardi Gras was founded in Mobile, and people in Mobile like to drink beer. So what more effective weapon to use than a beer keg? Oops. So the best, and this is General Maury describing it, very rude, and the best were beer kegs loaded with gunpowder and sensitive primers. So they used this. It wasn't so effective during the Battle of Mobile Bay because the salt water corroded a lot of those. One went off and did sink the Tecumseh, but largely ineffective. They corroded because of the salt water. But either the Confederates got better, or the brackish fresh water wasn't as corrosive, and they were highly effective during the campaign for Mobile. So effective that the Army constantly complained we're not getting any support at all, because the idea was the land forces would surround the forts from the west or east, and then the, like they did at Vicksburg, the Navy would get behind them and they would just be in trouble, right? Didn't happen. All right, so this is give you an idea. Here's an ironclad coming, and here's your beer kegs, the Mobile's favorite defense. Okay, so we got any Navy men here? You guys serve the Navy? What happens in the British Navy if a captain loses a ship, gets a mine, or gets a that's not good for the career, is it? Is it? It's not a good deal, right? All right. Well, I want you to put yourself in this situation. Okay, on March 28th, the Milwaukee, an Eads Monitor, double turreted, ironclad, state-of-the-art gunboat, hits a mine just south, a mile and a quarter south of Spanish Fort. Okay, the next day, the Osage, also a single turreted ironclad, it's another mine. 2 days, 2 vessels down, 2 ironclads down. Not good. Nothing happens the following day, and then on the 4th day, the Osage, it's a mine. Admiral Thatcher, who'd come down from the East Coast to come in and take over for Farragut for the Mobile campaign, he had lost 3 vessels in 4 days, and it got worse. I think he ended up losing about 8 vessels. Pretty bad. But it totally neutralized the U.S. Navy. The Navy really played very little role until maybe the last day in the siege of Spanish Fort. So that's something for military historians can appreciate, was the effectiveness of these defenses of Mobile, and the main thing was the torpedo. Now this is the Milwaukee. After the battle, it was designed by James Eads, the famous engineer. And Eads sent a barge into Mobile, had this vessel raised and transported to New Orleans and up the Mississippi River. You guys ever been to St. Louis? Okay. Well, whenever you go over that bridge there, it's still there today, the Eads Bridge, it was made from the remnants of the ironclad Milwaukee. They melted it down, and so when you go over that, you're actually driving over a connection with Mobile. See these connections that you see from the little old campaign of Mobile, Alabama, with the Eads Bridge. Okay, so after nearly 13 days, this guy, James Eads, I think I'm mispronouncing his name, but he was born in Edinburgh, Scotland. Geddes. Okay, he was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, and he fought with the British military in India, and I think it was actually would have been the Crimean War, and then he migrated to Canada. Then he found his way into the United States and joined the U.S. Army. And he was on the northern flank of Spanish Fort. And this, if you go there, it was a swamp, and the Confederates thought that it was impassable. So they didn't fortify that area as much as they should have in hindsight. But Geddes observed, he said, I think we can assault this. And finally, he got the okay on April 8th, because they were going to move. Basically, Canby was growing impatient with Spanish Fort, and he said, we're going to move up and take Spanish Fort. So on April 8th, they had the 8th Iowa attacked and succeeding in gaining a lodgment in Spanish Fort. And at that point, the Confederates, if you ask any military man, evacuating a position in the face of the enemy is one of the hardest things you can do, right? As we saw from our evacuation of Afghanistan. It's a pretty tough deal, right? Well, the Confederates evacuated Spanish Fort right under the noses of the Union soldiers within speaking distance, in one of the most amazing escapes, although to the big picture to no avail, because the war ended shortly thereafter, but they escaped. There was 2,600 troops there, about 2,000, a little over 2,000 escaped. The guys in the advanced rifle pits didn't make it out. The guys who were attacked during the assault probably were most largely captured. But they had a predetermined escape route, a little treadway pier, about 18 inches wide, that led over here. And down here you have 2 artillery positions in the marsh that are still there. And I actually did a little Indiana Jones work. I discovered the remnants of those pilings. They're still there. I found them. And I did a little video. I had to be careful about sharing it because we have a lot of relic hunters in Mobile, because there's a lot of stuff still out there. This little area right here, if you ever had the technology to do this, it's very dark water, but there are all kinds of relics in that water, but it's hard to get to. But anyways, I found it. My buddy and I went out there on a boat, and I did a video and submitted it to our archaeologists at the university, and you know, but I got to be careful I don't share the position too much, because I don't want people destroying it. All right. Meanwhile, while Canby's forces and Granger and J.J. Smith's force were moving up the eastern shore from Pensacola, Fort Barrancas in Pensacola, Frederick Steele led a column of odds and ends, including a division of U.S. colored troops, the second or third largest contingent ever deployed during the war. A very large force. Hawkins was Canby's brother-in-law, and he had with him a division, roughly 5,500 troops. And they marched up from Pensacola, Florida, up to the state line. They met, this is General Clanton, who basically started the Battle of Shiloh. He was a pretty tough guy and didn't always think clearly. He was more aggressive type. And he fought him a running battle at these different creeks that they passed over, eventually wounding him and capturing him. And then they went up, they cut the rail line at Pollard, Alabama, to make sure reinforcements couldn't get to the Confederates from the east. Marched up to Weatherford's plantation and down and descended on Blakely. And his forces was half or more than half of the force that was besieging Fort Blakely. So there's two forts on that river defending Mobile, Blakely and Spanish Fort. And that fell under attack on April 1st and lasted about a week. Okay, so the siege of Fort Blakely. That's about 4 miles north of Spanish Fort. You had Brian Thomas, who had a boy brigade. Basically, they robbed the cradle and the grave to outfit this command, and mostly teenage boys from Alabama. And then you had Francis Cockrell, who commanded the Missouri Brigade, very famous brigade in the Western Theater. Grant commented at one of the battles outside, I think it was Champion Hill, that Cockrell led the most amazing countercharge he'd ever witnessed during the war. So this guy was very well respected. He had the veterans there, but they were really battered. His numbers were way down by this point of the war. They had sustained heavy casualties. Everybody from the drummer boy to the commanding general had been wounded, most of them many times. In fact, part of the reason why they sent them to Mobile is because they knew they would be operating behind defensive works versus in the open field. So that was the best place for them. Cockrell was another Southerner that went on to acclaim. He was a favorite of Teddy Roosevelt. Cockrell served in the U.S. Congress for 30 years, and eventually he left Congress. He was a Democrat, and Roosevelt was a Republican. But nevertheless, Roosevelt had a lot of respect for Cockrell, and he was appointed to various committees, including a surveying committee. And at the age, I think he was 77, 78 years old, he surveyed the boundary lines between New Mexico territory and Texas. So he basically supervised. So that's another example of a Southerner who helped literally shape the United States. All right, so the siege of Blakely, it was a massive attack. Basically, the Union was very upset about Spanish Fort escaping. They had been sieging these guys for 2 weeks, and they wanted to, they're trying to end the war, and these guys got away. So it said, we don't want the same thing to happen at Blakely. So the next day, April 9th, about 3 hours after General Lee had surrendered at Appomattox, they assaulted Fort Blakely. And that there's General Steele. He was an animal lover, as you can tell from this picture, but at some point during the siege, his horse got away from the handler and ran into the Confederate works. I don't know if you ever saw him again. I don't know, but he was very upset about that. Now, at Blakely, which is a state park you can go to and visit, very well preserved. If you ever get in the area, I encourage you to go. 14 Medal of Honors were awarded, and really an amazing historical site. All right, so Blakely has fell, Spanish Fort has fell, but Mobile, and the next day sounds the evacuation alarm. The bells are ringing, time to get out of Dodge. You know, we can't defend Mobile because they're going to gain access to the river system and besiege us. So they're in trouble. The only thing in their way are these two batteries, Battery UG and Tracy. And they're commanded by this guy, Isaac W. Patton. Okay, he was a veteran of Vicksburg and wounded at Vicksburg, and pretty tough guy from a military family. And for 2 days, they've been holding back. They didn't have a lot of ammunition. For 2 days, they unleashed the fury on occupied Spanish fort, and they held nothing back. And there are a lot of comments. They couldn't believe that this fort was so ferocious. Basically exhausted most of their ammunition and evacuated with maybe one casualty on April 11th. But for 2 days, they unleashed the fury on occupied Spanish fort. Now, that's no surprise because, you know, this guy was a notable guy. After the war, he became mayor of New Orleans, but he was also the nephew of this guy. You know who this guy is? Yeah. Next to a pretty sharp guy, George Patton, and that was his great uncle. So, and it was interesting because Patton made a comment: fixed fortifications are a testament to man's stupidity, but his great uncle did pretty well at UG and Tracy. All right, so Mobile evacuates. They fall back to Meridian, and the Navy goes up to Demopolis, and you know, basically, you know, a couple weeks later, the final surrender. The Mobile fell on April 12th. The Navy actually didn't go up that way. They cut across, which they should have done anyways. They could have probably taken Mobile out of having to mess with Blake. And they marched up, and they marched up the Bay Shell Road. Phoebe, that's where we used to have our cross-country meets. And the mayor, this is the Shell Road as it looked at the time. It was made out of seashells, white seashells, which was quite a sight for a northerner to see something like that. So they marched up there, and the mayor, the Confederates had already evacuated. The mayor comes down, and he didn't have a white flag, so he put a white bed sheet on the back of a horse and buggy and then surrendered the city to representatives of the U.S. Navy and Army. That was Mayor Slough. Now, this is Dabney Maury, and this is what he had to say about Mobile. He said the people of Mobile had events during the whole war, a deep devotion to the cause of their country. The women of Mobile would make care packages. They would send it over to Spanish Fort Blakely, and you know, even when the forts were captured, the Union troops immediately started eating the food that they found there, which was, by most of the accounts, was far superior to what they'd been issued by the U.S. Army. So the people of Mobile really supported the effort. All right, but don't take it from, because the common myth is, oh, there were all these Unionists in Mobile, and there were a few, but they were a minority. But don't take it from Maury. This is General Thomas Kilby Smith, and he was the commanding officer of occupied Mobile later after the siege. This is what he had to say about people of Mobile. You hear that there's Union sentiment in Mobile, perhaps not 10% of its people are secessionists, but my word for it, that not a man, woman, or child who's lived in Mobile the last 4 years, but who prays death and destruction to the damn Yankees. So that was probably the greater sentiment in Mobile. All right, so on April 29th, General Canby met with Richard Taylor just north of Mobile at McGee Farm. That building's still there. It's privately owned, used to be a museum, still there. I passed by it quite a bit. And they met and had a ceasefire agreement. Canby offered the same terms that Sherman offered General Johnston that were disallowed the very next day. So they had made this nice meeting, nice arrangements. Hey, we're into this thing. And Canby had the embarrassing task of having to telegraph Richard Taylor and say, hey, sorry, but I can't offer you what I offered you yesterday. But he was authorized to give the same terms that General Lee received from General Grant, which were very generous by any standard. So they met again at Centinel, Alabama, a little bit further up. And it was the only surrender. This surrender was unique for a lot of reasons. It was the only surrender that took place outdoors. It was the last surrender east of the Mississippi River, but I would argue this was the last surrender of the war of an intact force. Okay, yes, the Trans-Mississippi did surrender technically a little bit later, but they had largely already disbanded. Okay, Kirby Smith didn't even show up for the meeting. Richard Taylor had to surrender the force in New Orleans. It was more of a clear the records book. I would argue that the last actual surrender of a significant force took place in Central Alabama on May 4th, 1865. And that was the tree. It was called the Surrender Oak, where they had the parley. And on May 25th, about 21 days after the surrender, an explosion took place in Mobile. And what happened is the Union forces gathered up all the munitions and black powder and all this other stuff, and they decided to load it into a warehouse on the Mobile River, which is not far from businesses and industry and hotels and that sort of thing. And something happened. They don't know exactly who caused it, because whoever caused it got blown to smithereens. And what happened was an explosion occurred. I would say that this was the largest explosion the world had ever seen, man-made explosion the world had ever seen up until this point. It obliterated 8 to 9 square blocks of downtown Mobile. It killed well over 300 people, destroyed everything. People in Spring Hill, which is 7 miles away, were knocked off their feet. You know, at Dolphin Island, the Union soldiers occupying Dolphin Island thought that Mobile was under attack by force. But to give you an idea of what it did, pretty amazing, the destruction. This is looking west towards like where South Alabama is. So it was totally destroyed. Pretty bad deal. Now, after the war, this is General Maury. He had a cousin who also served in Mobile. His name was Harry Maury. Harry Maury is the most interesting individual that fought in the Civil War. And you probably don't even know who he is. Look him up. This guy was absolutely amazing. Unbelievable. Look him up. You'll thank me for it. Incredible character. Incredible character. Wounded many times, arrested many times. There's a whole kinds of stories. But you guys have seen the movie Free State of Jones. Very poor movie, by the way. It was very historically inaccurate. But that department of Mississippi was under his command at the time. And what they totally left out of the movie, they kind of cut to modern times just before Harry Maury showed up. So they portrayed Jones County beating all these local forces and beating these Confederates, but they didn't talk about, the book does, but they didn't talk about Harry Maury and the 15th Confederate Cavalry that was largely from Mobile, were sent up there, and they ran Newton Knight and his gang out of Jones County into the swamps and killed a lot of them and handled them dealt with the traitors, quote unquote, very roughly. Okay. So fast forward to the end of the war. He moves to Louisiana, Plaquemines Parish, I believe, just where Slidell, Louisiana is, just outside of New Orleans, and he starts up a rosin and turpentine plantation. And as soon as he gets there, he starts getting these threats from these local dirtbags or rednecks or whatever you want to call them. One guy even came to his front porch and threatened him. So at that point, little Dabney would carry around a revolver with him for protection. One day he was in New Orleans, came back to his plantation. It was on fire. Someone set fire to his turpentine plantation, all the trees, burning it up. And so he had enough. That was it. But he never really understood who were these. What was the deal? The guys who were threatening him were Newton Knight's gang. That had been, when they were driven out of Jones County, they went over to Louisiana, and they basically, the surname Maury was kind of like the red sheep to the bull, and they, like I said, they left it out of Free State of Jones. One of my former athletes was played one of the soldiers in Free State of Jones in the movie. So, did the Mobile campaign matter? Yes, Mobile was still an important place as a logistical center. The campaign was an important part of Grant's grand strategy to end the war. Mobile was the second largest city, second only to Richmond, remaining under Confederate controls at this point. As I mentioned before, a valuable logistical center. It was the last siege of the war. Fort Blakely was the last major battle and the largest battle fought in the state of Alabama. And it guaranteed the end of the Civil War, led to the last actual surrender of the war. It also was unique for a military historian because it illustrated the advancement of warfare from the beginning of the war to the end. At Mobile, the battle was much more like a World War I battle than it was a Civil War battle. You had hand grenades, you had landmines, you had sea mines, you had ironclad vessels, you had combined naval and army operations that were coordinated. You had siege warfare, you had trench warfare. So if you examine Mobile, that's kind of the first time where all those things were put together. Even though historically it's been understudied because it happened so late, it didn't have a lot of impact on the final outcome of the war. It has a lot of significance to a military historian who studies these things and like the torpedoes and how effective they were. And it happens. It deserves recognition. The guys that fought here didn't have the benefit of hindsight. Okay, both sides fought like the war depended on them, and there were acts of bravery and heroism, as the 14 Medal of Honors that were awarded at Blakely and the one at Spanish Fort, that would rival any battle of the war. So it happened, and it deserves recognition.